Hello and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking about why I decided to return to China after living abroad in Japan. Well, got my list here of the reasons why I originally left, so I figured I'd go through each of these one by one and then give a little more detail in terms of some of the other things that made me decide to return to China. So, if you haven't seen the video where I talk about why I left, go ahead and take a look at it. I'll put a link in the description below so you can get a little more information as to why I left and have a point of reference to the list that I'm going to be going through now. So without further ado, let's begin. So one of the first reasons I talked about why I left China after my first 5 years was ESL was changing, or English to speakers of other languages, or just English teaching abroad in general. And that was certainly still true at the time when I decided to leave Japan. And after talking about what I had seen in Japan and not really enjoying my experience teaching there, or at least what ESL was while I was living there, and just job satisfaction in general, ESL in China, from what my contacts who were still there had said, was kind of stabilizing. You weren't seeing as many training centers closed down. Certainly there were more regulations and a few more hurdles to not only get in country but to kind of remain in country. And like they said, it seemed to stabilize. The changes weren't coming as fast and as furious, and crackdowns on people with the wrong type of visa, which if you got the wrong type of visa, I totally understand why they would crack down on that. But just other regulatory changes that seem to make it a little more difficult to both operate an English training center or education center or university or whatever. Those had seemed to stabilize. So figured, I guess all the changes are done. We know what things are looking like. We can kind of predict what's going to go on and go forward. There was still a much bigger adult teaching market in China versus Japan. People were still interested. People were still very gung-ho and very focused for the most part in learning, and there was still a need for people to teach adults. Granted, kids were still becoming a big part of the market, but it wasn't, at least if you had gone to a training center, it wasn't as, generally speaking, again, some places, specialized in kids, but the ones that focused on adults, like where I used to work, Web International English, was still composed mostly of adults. So I figured, okay, well, it's changed, it's stabilized, so going forward I know what to expect. And it's second one, I talked about the Tianjin Explosion and my experience being there in the city but not near the blast radius or anything at the time, and my feelings towards that. Well, after being away a couple of years, or about a year and a half, I realized, maybe I overreacted. Maybe the explosion was as crazy as it was. Maybe it was a one-time event. Maybe, I was just going through the initial shock and the anxiety of it happening, of being sent out not far to help one of our sister branches during that time when a couple teachers left, and worried about fallout from all these chemicals that were purportedly spread out throughout the city. And maybe I, kind of overreacted to that. Maybe I still felt that the lack of transparency was there, but it seemed as though things weren't as bad as they seemed or could have been. So thought, it's a one-off event. Certainly there were other things that were not transparent and probably were never going to be, but I figured this is something that even for them was kind of out of their hands and out of their control, so shouldn't use it anymore as a reason why I left or continued to stay out of country. Third reason is talked about how I didn't feel welcome. Well, I talked about in Japan how it was hard to make friends because people, although they were polite, they weren't friendly. You never knew where you stood with people in a relationship or an acquaintanceship for a variety of reasons. You can take a look at the other videos where I talk about that. But in China, people were still pretty welcoming to foreigners, despite things you had seen in the government, despite PSAs, about us being spies, despite, Western influence and all this other kind of nonsense they talk about. From what my contact said, and even students who I kept in contact with, everyone was still not just polite, but very friendly, very curious about, what's going on in my life, and if I was coming back, and when I was coming back, and so on. So I felt that again, like the Tianjin Explosion, that maybe I was a bit too quick to judgment, a bit too harsh in my criticism, and that, like in my own country, the government is generally not a reflection of the people. They can be two different things, and they usually are two different things. So I figured, maybe the government's drumming up propaganda, or propaganda for domestic consumption, and a lot of people are just kind of whatever, hey foreigners, how you doing? Welcome, So figured that was not a reason to stay away anymore. General frustrations, as I mentioned in that prior video why I left, they're always going to be there. And I gave a list of things. Figured, there's nothing I can do about those things. They're out of my control, whether it's a cultural difference, whether it's a hygiene difference, whether it's any number of things. So I didn't think that was something that necessarily should hold me back from returning or keep me away. Simply because there's nothing I can do about it. But I know how to deal with it. I know how to avoid it. So figured that was another not a good reason to stay away. Next one, talked about relationship difficulties, which, like general frustrations, is something that's going to happen really anywhere. People come and go in your life. People move. People have changes of circumstances. You're going to have things that you're not going to be able to see eye to eye on. And that's cross-cultural, cross-border, cross-time. So it wasn't a legitimate reason to not be there. And, looking at it from the 30,000-foot view, I had a lot of really good, solid relationships when I was there. And chances are I would find another one. I just had to open myself up to someone. And it was more likely to happen there than it did or it did not in Japan. Next reason, aging out. Still an issue, certainly. And at the time when I left Japan, which would have been 2018, I was about, 40, so that would be, 30, I was about 40 years old. And I knew from prior experience going there and being there 5 years that 50 was that age where the job market, or the jobs that would consider hiring you, would significantly shrink. But still had about another 10 years beyond that when it would be next to impossible. So I figured, okay, I still have at least a decade of an open window where it'll be pretty easy, and I have a ton of experience, from living there the first time. So, there won't be the initial culture shock anymore. I know how to get around. I don't need as much assistance going there, so I can still eke out have a good lifestyle, save money. Still young enough to go out and do stuff and enjoy my time there. So figured that wouldn't or shouldn't be something to hold me back from returning. Next one, pollution. Sure, it was still an issue to a certain degree, there were more blue sky days and nice weather days there, especially as more air quality index numbers were coming out and a little more transparency, maybe via outside sources in terms of what the air quality was, and whether it was in that bad range where you should really stay in, or it was in a tolerable range where it's okay to stay out for a limited amount of time. Plus, being already aware of it from my first time there, I knew how to reduce the effects, again, wearing a mask, having an air filter in my place. And I know I talked about before how I wanted to live in a place where I didn't have to deal with that. Well, I figured I knew exactly what I would be getting into had I, at the time, decided to return. So it wasn't a big surprise or a big shocker. It was a bummer, to say the least, but at least there were days that were a little bit better, and I knew what I need to do to, push through the nastiness of that pollution. Not just air, I talked about tap water you can't drink and other things, but at least I knew, do this, not this. And so figured it's less of a consideration, given the other things no longer were a consideration to stay away. And I talked about visiting Japan and liking it. Well, I've already, a place is very different, or your experience of a place is very different when you visit than when you live there. And I had done both with Japan. While living in China, I visited Japan, and when I left China, I lived in Japan. So the rose-colored image I had of Japan was no longer the case. I saw the good and the bad, and a lot of the bad I didn't like. And so there was no more of the honeymoon phase of being in Japan. That was gone. I saw it for what it was. And like I said, there's some good stuff that I really miss about Japan, and there's a lot of stuff I don't. Just like with China, just like with really even my own home country. There are things I really hate and things I really love. So that was no longer a reason to keep me away. That, hey, I want to see what it's like living in this country. Been there, done that. Last thing I talked about in the prior video is frequency of visits home. Sure, going back to China, I'd be going through the same kind of long-term planning of, okay, my next visit's going to be in 3 years or 4 years, or whenever I can accumulate enough vacation time or save enough money to offset that cost. But as I looked at it, I had visited home before Japan. I went home after Japan, so I figured, okay, I'm pretty good for a couple of years. And after I left Japan, I didn't go back to China. See, I left Japan in August of 2018, and it wasn't until about December of the same year where I landed back in China, in Tianjin. So I had several months and several holidays that I was able to enjoy back home with family and friends, and do a little bit of traveling. So it was, I guess I got my fill of the visits for a bit, or got enough time. So that concludes, going through the prior reasons why I left China in the first place. So now let me talk about some added reasons why I decided to go back, despite everything I talked about before. A few months prior to leaving Japan, I believe around the time I had given notice, I started, maybe even before that, I started looking around on the usual ESL websites to see what jobs were out there outside of Japan. So started looking at places like Vietnam, Thailand, South Korea again, Taiwan, since I had visited there while I was living in Japan. I might talk about Taiwan in another video. And started looking at the cost of living, started looking at the exchange rate of whatever I'd be paid there, so I can figure out how much I could save based on what an average budget would look like living there. And looking at what world was, I guess, in each place, and certainly applied for several jobs. Got a few emails back and got some extra details. But a lot of these places I had never visited. Taiwan, at least I had a traveler's point of view of it. I figured it could be a smooth transition. I mean, Taiwanese dialect and Mandarin or Putonghua is close enough to be discernible amongst each other. And, the pollution and the air quality was better. Internet and other things were open. Nothing was censored or hard to get to. And it seemed like the people were nice, so I figured, could go there. South Korea was always interesting, but again, I also had a visitor's point of view, and I didn't really venture out as much as I wish I did during that trip, which I'll certainly talk about in a future video. And the job offers for most of these places, I started looking at, doing the calculations and realized I'm not going to be getting a little more than Japan in some cases, in other cases getting less, even though the cost of living's less, but I won't be able to save as much money. I'm not going to be able to travel as frequently as I want to, especially out of country, because the exchange rates would be unfavorable. So it seemed like China was the only place that was paying well, at the time in some cases better than what I was getting paid before. All the same opportunities were there: training centers, universities, international schools, and so on. And as I was putting on my resume, I get a lot of contacts from employers in China. Ton of them, in fact. And, would thank them and say, right now I'm not considering China, because I wanted to try someplace different. Fast forward, was still in contact with people back in China, expats and locals, and word got around to my prior employer, Web, that I was looking for a job and was looking to leave Japan. And so, and I'll leave names out of this and won't go into fine detail, but I was contacted by one of the people in management there, or higher up, saying, "Hey, we heard you're looking, and we really miss your teaching. You were well liked by the students and staff, and we would like to. We want to know if you're interested in coming back." And in our email discussions, I mentioned, well, there were these things I didn't like, and I mentioned teaching kids, which, it's no surprise, I've talked about this in other videos. I said, I got out of one situation teaching a lot of kids and playing a lot of games and singing and stuff. I kind of want to avoid that as much as possible, which was another reason why a lot of offers from other countries I kind of turned down, because it was just that. No thanks. And after some back and forth, they made some concessions, which I was very surprised at, and I appreciated very much, in terms of what my schedule would be like, in terms of my pay, which was a big reason why I started considering going back to the same school, back to the same country, back to the same city. There was a very big pay raise. Without getting into the number, it was about, I believe it was like a 40 to 45% pay increase for the same job, for the same hours. And when I heard that, I was taken aback. I'm like, I know how much I can save if I'm back in China under my old pay, and it was pretty decent. But now they're offering me this huge bump. And, except for teaching a few kids' classes in a more structured approach, which they had finally ironed out, which I was very grateful for. I was taken aback by this. I'm like, wow, wait a minute, I can save this amount of money. I can live this much better than I was originally. It's kind of hard to say no. And I still have my friends there. And so I've got my support structure, and I know the lay of the land there very easily, and I can just be dropped off and hit the ground, running at full speed. So said, "Oh, let me think about it." But of course, with everything I talked about before, with the offer, the very generous offer they had given me, it was hard to say no. And the alternatives weren't things that I was open to or thought were good deals for me at the time. So after a little soul searching and a lot of thinking, I said, yeah, where do I sign up? So I went through the process, which certainly there were more hurdles. I think that's when the apostilling process for documents had started. So if you had you always had to have a copy of your degree and send it out as part of the paperwork to get the visa and the work contract and permits and all that. At the time, when I first went, it was just copy, scan copy, send it over, you're good to go. Now it was, okay, we need to see transcripts, which I think in Japan I had to do as well. But you also need to take your degree and get it apostilled. So get it certified and then get it certified with the embassy, and there's a whole host of stuff you have to do. So it was a little more complex than before, and in part it was a big reason why it took me from August all the way to December. Stuff had to be sent and then re-forwarded from that point, and different paperwork had to be filled out along the way and so on. So it's kind of like starting from scratch plus these extra things. But went through it, smooth in terms of, okay, this step and this step and this step and this step, even if there were more steps. And once I got through that, I believe it was December the 13th or 18th of 2018 when I arrived in Tianjin. And started working, if not the next day, the day after, and didn't need to be trained. Just, here you go, here's your schedule, you know what to do. And I did it, and I was right back into the old life. So anyhow, that's why I decided to go back to China after deciding to leave and be in Japan for about a year. So I'll stop here and see you guys in the next video.